The story begins far from crowded cities and bright lights. It begins in the middle of a vast blue sea, a sea crossed by merchants, fishermen, explorers, and warships for centuries. Hidden within those waters are two island groups that have become some of the most disputed territories in Asia: Paracel Islands and the Spratly Islands, known in Vietnam as Hoang Sa and Truong Sa. Here is the question that still sparks fierce debate today. If these islands are just small pieces of land surrounded by endless waves, why have nations argued over them for decades? Why have ships confronted each other there? Why have soldiers lost their lives there? And why does the issue remain one of the most sensitive topics in the region? To understand the dispute, we must travel back hundreds of years into history. Long before modern maps, satellites, and international treaties existed, Vietnamese sailors regularly ventured into the dangerous waters of the East Sea. Historical records describe Vietnamese teams known as the Hoang Sa Flotilla. These groups were organized under Vietnamese rulers to sail to the islands, collect resources, rescue shipwrecked goods, and carry out official missions. Ancient Vietnamese documents recorded these activities in remarkable detail. The islands were not simply distant rocks. They were places where state-appointed teams operated under government authority. Year after year, generation after generation, voyages continued. And then the story becomes even more dramatic. Historical records from Vietnam's feudal dynasties describe official management of these islands. Maps created during different periods identified the territories as belonging to Vietnamese realms. Administrative actions were documented. Taxes, missions, and maritime operations were recorded. The evidence did not appear overnight. It accumulated over centuries. Meanwhile, foreign travelers and mapmakers also left behind accounts. Some maps produced outside the region placed Chinese territories far north of the disputed islands. These historical documents would later become important pieces of evidence in international discussions. History in the East Sea was never peaceful for long. As European colonial powers expanded across Asia, the geopolitical landscape changed dramatically. Control over territories became increasingly tied to international law and strategic interests. During the French colonial period, when France administered Vietnam, French authorities continued activities related to Hoang Sa and Truong Sa. Weather stations were established. Administrative measures were implemented. Official declarations were issued. The islands remained connected to the administration governing Vietnam. Then came war. The Second World War shook Asia from one end to the other. Imperial Japan expanded across the region and occupied numerous territories, including islands in the East Sea. Old systems collapsed. Borders became uncertain. Military forces moved rapidly across the ocean. The war ended, a new struggle emerged. Who would control the territories left behind? The answer was far from simple. As countries rebuilt after the devastation of war, competing claims appeared. Governments examined historical documents. Old maps were studied. Diplomatic statements multiplied, and the tension kept rising. Then came one of the most dramatic moments in the entire story. In 1974, a naval clash occurred around the Paracel Islands. South Vietnamese forces confronted Chinese forces in a battle that shocked the region. Fighting was brief but intense. Ships exchanged fire. Sailors were killed. When the battle ended, China gained control of the entire Paracel archipelago. For Vietnam, this became a painful turning point. The islands that had long been associated with Vietnamese administration were now under the control of another country. Yet the story did not end there. Far to the south lay the Spratly Islands, a scattered collection of reefs, rocks, and small islands spread across a vast area of sea. Multiple countries claimed parts of the region. Competition intensified as strategic and economic interests grew. Then another confrontation erupted. In 1988, forces from Vietnam and China clashed near Johnson South Reef. The encounter became one of the most tragic chapters in modern Vietnamese maritime history. Vietnamese personnel lost their lives during the confrontation. Images and stories from that event would remain deeply emotional for generations. The waters around Truong Sa had become more than a geographical dispute. They had become a symbol of sacrifice, a symbol of sovereignty, a symbol of memory. And then the conflict entered a new era. Instead of battles involving only ships and weapons, attention shifted toward construction, infrastructure, and presence on the ground. Over the years, China carried out large-scale activities on several features it controlled in the South China Sea. Artificial islands were developed, airstrips appeared, ports expanded. Buildings rose from reefs that had once barely broken the ocean surface. Satellite images captured astonishing transformations. Places that had once looked like tiny specks surrounded by water suddenly resembled military outposts and small settlements. The scale of construction attracted international attention. Many countries expressed concern. Analysts debated the implications. Experts warned that the balance of power in the region was changing. At the same time, Vietnam continued maintaining its presence on features under its control in the Spratly Islands. Vietnamese personnel remained stationed there. Civilian facilities were developed. Communities continued living and working in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. And this is where the drama reaches its highest point. Because the dispute is not only about history, it is not only about maps, it is not only about old documents stored in archives, it is also about strategic sea routes. Every year, enormous amounts of global trade pass through these waters. Energy resources may exist beneath the seabed. Fishing grounds support countless livelihoods. Military planners view the region as one of the most important maritime zones in the world. Control of islands can influence control of surrounding waters. Control of surrounding waters can influence regional power, and regional power can shape the future of entire nations. That is why the dispute remains so intense. Supporters of Vietnam's position often point to centuries of historical administration, documented activities of the Hoang Sa and Bach Hai teams, official records from Vietnamese dynasties, colonial-era administration, and continuous assertions of sovereignty. Meanwhile, China argues that historical connections and various historical interpretations support its own claims. The disagreement is profound. Neither side sees the issue as minor. Neither side sees the issue as temporary. And that is why the debate continues today. Yet beyond politics and strategy lies something even more powerful: memory. For many Vietnamese people, Hoang Sa and Truong Sa are not simply names on a map. They represent generations of sailors who crossed dangerous seas. They represent soldiers who stood on remote islands far from home. They represent stories passed from one generation to another. The dispute may be discussed in conference rooms and international forums. It may appear in legal arguments and diplomatic statements. For countless people, it is also deeply personal. Historians examine old records. They search for facts. Governments present claims. They search for legitimacy. When nations negotiate, they search for solutions. When ordinary people hear the words Hoang Sa and Truong Sa, many hear something else. They hear echoes from the past. They hear stories of voyages across endless waters. They hear memories of sacrifice. And they hear a question that remains unanswered after decades of tension. Sea shaped by history, conflict, and competing claims, what will ultimately decide the future of these islands? Ancient documents, international law, diplomacy, power, or the determination of those who refuse to let history be forgotten? The waves continue to crash against distant shores. The ships continue to sail across contested waters. The arguments continue in courts, conferences, and diplomatic meetings. And somewhere beyond the horizon, surrounded by wind and sea, Hoang Sa and Truong Sa remain at the center of one of the most dramatic territorial disputes of the modern age. A dispute rooted in centuries of history, marked by conflict, and still unfolding before the eyes of the world today.